Black people are within an abusive relationship with a narcissistic white society. And just like within most abusive relationships, they've convinced many black people to believe that their mistreatments of us was our own fault. This is not victim peddling as so many of us have been brainwashed to think. It's the absolute truth. Black people are the unknowing victims of the worst gaslighting mental abuse in world history. Usually the term gaslighting mental abuse is associated with individual abusive relationships wherein which one person is manipulated and mentally abused by a narcissistic partner. However, and likewise, Black people are being manipulated and mentally abused by the narcissistic white society. And just like within the individual relationships wherein which the narcissistic person often trauma bonds their victims, likewise, Black people have been trauma bonded by the white society. First, here's how trauma bond is achieved within individual relationships. Within that scenario, after repeatedly brutalizing the victim, the narcissistic abuser never acknowledges any of his wrongdoing. He instead minimizes the abuse and tells the victim that the abuse wasn't that bad and to just shut up and get over it. He then constantly inundates the victim with demoralizing, disapproving narratives about the victim. This is continued until the victim stops focusing on the abused and instead focus only on the demoralizing, disapproving narrative. This causes the abused victim to, rather than resenting the abuser, they will instead seek the approval of the abuser. This trauma bonding effect provides the abuser with a more favorable outcome from the victim rather than having the victim resenting and hating him. The mind is easy to manipulate when the victim is unaware of what's being done. Likewise, this same trauma bonding manipulation tactic is what white social engineering scientists and white propagandists have done to the Black population. After the white society brutalized Black people for many centuries, they never acknowledged the severity of their wrongdoings. They instead insist that it wasn't that bad and most often tell Black people to just shut up and get over it. They then constantly inundates Black people with demoralizing, disapproving narratives about ourselves. Therefore, rather than resenting the white society for their brutal mistreatment of us, many of us instead focuses only on those disapproving narratives and therefore tries to win the approval of the white society. Many Black people will go out of their way to try to show white people that we're not all bad. And most Black people are clueless of how their minds have gotten this way. This is the truth of our plight and condition. Black people have been trauma bonded to the narcissistic white society. The minds of targeted populations are quite easy to manipulate if they're unaware of what's being done to them. Once minds have been confused, manipulation becomes simple. The mind will even ignore common sense, and rationality falls away, even overlooking hypocrisy and deception. The white society has exploited its monopoly over information that we receive to create a prison for our minds. They also constantly create false narratives that exonerates themselves and that places all blames of our historical hardships that we've endured onto us. And they then impose those falsehoods upon us as being factual. Many Black people accept them as being true and then develops contemptuous feelings towards our own racial group and develops an undeserving adoration towards the white society. Case, point, and proof. The version of the African slave trade as taught to us by the white societies reduces their culpability by deliberately shifting the blame of slavery away from the white society and placing the blame more greatly upon we Africans. It does so by miseducating us to believe that most enslaved Africans were sold away by other Africans and were therefore fairly purchased by the white enslavers. Many black people accepted this as being true, and this shifted their resentment away from the white enslavers and redirected it toward their fellow Africans, thus benefiting the white society. But those of us who accepted it as being true are not critical thinkers. Those of us who do critically think know that it's untrue that most of our ancestors were sold off and were therefore fairly purchased by the white enslavers. We know it's untrue because originally Africans owned all of the gold, diamonds, minerals, and natural resources, and Western money had no value whatsoever in Africa. The Western world had nothing that Africans needed that could have been used to purchase the majority of millions of enslaved Africans. Certainly, the truth is the white enslavers therefore instead exploited their weaponry advantage of guns, rifles, and cannons to steal the majority of the enslaved Africans. The white society constantly creates false narratives that exonerates themselves and it places all blames of our historical hardships upon us, and it imposes those falsehoods upon us as being true. It's the worst mental abusing, gaslighting warfare in history. They also gaslight us whenever we attempt to speak out against white racism. Nowadays, whenever a black person attempts to protest any mistreatment we endure within the white society, the white establishment never legitimizes any of our grievances. They instead respond by presenting counter-narratives that undermines and distracts from our grievances, such as accusing us of victim peddling or playing the race card. These are counter-narratives that are deliberately designed to deflect and distract from whatever issue we attempt to protest. Within this gaslighting scenario, the white establishment never acknowledges nor legitimizes any grievances presented by the black population. The white establishment instead presents counter-narratives that distracts from the protests. This is actually what's happening with the All Lives Matters rebuttal by the white establishment. The oppressor's history clearly demonstrates that all lives matters has never been their belief system. Throughout history, the oppressors have demonstrated a complete disregard for the human lives of other racial groups. Their subjugation, murder, and exploitation of all other races are unparalleled. They're merely now using the All Lives Matter slogan to deflect and to diffuse the moral statement of Black Lives Matters, while diverting attention away from the issue of white cops routinely killing innocent, unarmed black people. Within this psychological warfare system, the white establishment is never acknowledged as being morally wrong, and the black oppressed is never acknowledged as being morally correct. Information is instead always twisted, spun, or selectively omitted to always favor the oppressors. This gaslighting system allows the white oppressors to deflect all black protests. It's also actually what's being done when the white establishment labels black people who speaks out against white racism as being racist toward the white society. This tactic forces the black speaker against white racism to instead engage in defending him or herself against a false accusation of being racist towards whites. Meanwhile, the original issue of white racism that's being protested is never addressed. This gaslighting tactics continue until the black protesters becomes mentally fatigued and stop protesting. Many black protesters begin to doubt their own position. Many begin to doubt their reasons for protesting, thinking that if their cause isn't being recognized by the dominant culture, then perhaps it lacks merit. As I said, the minds of targeted populations are quite easily manipulated if they're unaware of what's being done to them. Once minds have been confused, manipulation becomes simple The mind will even ignore common sense, and rationality falls away, even overlooking hypocrisy and deception. What oppressive forces are waging a war against Black people that most don't understand? Not all wars are fought on a battlefield. Most are fought in the mind. Black people, it's time to elevate your minds and wake up. It's time to wake up. When we sit around believing in the biblical fairy tale and legislation, they're laughing at us. We're making damn fools of ourselves. We have to learn the social sciences that the white society deploys to facilitate their ongoing long-term oppression of us. It's time to wake up.